We are back here live for the block party. Last week we had to pre-record it, but we're going to get you guys the goods in real time today. We got a week 15 overview of this GPP slate. No more buys. We got a jam-packed slate, so we'll review the landscape. Then we'll go position by position, get Jmtowin's favorite plays, and then we'll wrap up, as always, with a lineup build on DraftKings, utilizing some of JM's favorite building blocks. I'm Pete Overzet. This is the block party with Jmtowin. Let's do it.
Peter's one of the greatest depositors I've ever seen.
Trust the process. Let's go.
I got auto matched with Levitan. Bullshit.
I just go the other way. In that 66, I win all the money. All the money.
If I had 150 lineups, I'd win too.
AP, close spot, bullets in your head like KD. Bust it, bitch, go bust it. And I had 10 pints with me in Russia.
Hey everyone.
All right, Jmtowin back here in the saddle. I was legitimately excited to get your thoughts about like how tournaments shook out last week. One of the, highest scoring slates we've ever seen. I mean, there were good teams that I saw built by people. I'm like, that's a really good team. That's a really nice Brock Purdy double stack. And you were like 50 points off of first place. I mean, how do you process a week like that where you had to be absolutely perfect to win? And were you one of those who were perfect last week?
Yeah, it's one of those where you kind of look at how we end up with a high scoring weekend, and it's just the random nature of Sam Darnold's 5-touchdown game going to Addison and Justin Jefferson, falling on the same week as Josh Allen's huge game, which obviously correlated with Puka Nakua's big game. Coinciding with these two cheap running backs being available, well, more than two, but these two who ended up hitting Charbonnet in particular going for 40 plus points. And so it's one of those weird spots where you get one of those scores and you're like, oh man, I'm ahead of the field or I'm doing great. Like you get JJ early or Addison early and you feel like you're way ahead of the field because of the nature of this season. But then the late slate shakes out, the late portion of the slate shakes out, and it's like you're getting more and more of these big scores. Pete, was I one of those people last week? So here's my story last week, and I told you on the show last week about Evelyn throwing up all night midweek. So I caught that on Saturday. So I had two Aiden O'Connell rosters built, a Jameis roster built, and my final plan was a Sam Darnold roster and a Josh Allen Puka roster, a Sam Darnold double and a Josh Allen Puka roster.
Oh no, I know where
so
this is going.
It's Saturday night. I've been every hour or so throwing up, and then like I'll fall asleep for 30 minutes and then get up and throw up again. And it's like 10 o'clock and I'm like, I got to build a couple more rosters. And I was like, I can't build this Darnold double. I can't build this Josh Allen Puka roster. I was like, let me just do another variation of one of these Aiden O'Connell rosters, enter everything and just call it a weekend. So yeah, that was my weekend, was very close to having kind of the two stacks that you needed. I was hyper-focused on Saquon, as you know. So the Josh Allen roster that like, once you put Josh Allen and Puka on there, and then you're playing Saquon, Charbonnet, and Garendo on the roster, like it was pretty clear to me, like there's very few spots left, right? Like how those final spots would have shaken out. So that would have been like a 225 pointer. There was like a few different ways to build that one. Had Justin Jefferson on two of my four rosters, but I had Jordan Addison on more of my practice builds than Justin Jefferson. And just like the nature of the week didn't get to Jordan Addison because of, not building extra rosters. So yeah, weird week for me, but it was, it's just one of those weeks that reminds us how different DFS can be and kind of segues nicely into this week, where, highest owned quarterbacks, among the 7 highest owned quarterbacks are CJ Stroud, who has topped 20 points twice all season, Justin Herbert, who's topped 20 points twice all season, Anthony Richardson, who we can't trust, Will Levis, who we can't trust, Drake May. So it's like, this is showing us the type of week that this is, where it's like, we don't really love anything. Okay, let's play these guys. They look good on paper. Right now it's Rico, Dowdle, and Chuba Hubbard chalk week. What could go wrong, right? It's one of these weeks where the chalk plays aren't bad chalk plays in the context of what the week provides, but then it's like, okay, we're going to have some surprising things happen this week again if everybody's building through these avenues where it's like, I don't actually really like this, but it's the best on this slate, right? And so I think this is a unique slate for kind of thinking differently about how we attack the week. My player grid is going to be constructed differently with a different approach than normal, just to account for the type of week that it is. So weird week last week, and I don't think that's going to change this week.
Yeah. And I mean, as I kind of pull up the games here for this week, is there anything that you think about differently as far as when we do have more games? No buys. We got a 12 game slate. Obviously we have the 2 games on Monday, the Sunday Night Football. But we still have just so many different places to go. Do you find yourself getting more spread out, or does it actually make you want to narrow even more and let the field make mistakes since there's so many options?
This particular week, I'm more narrowed than normal in terms of what stands out to me on paper. But then I also think that probably the way to win this week is to some extent to build away from just what stands out the most on paper. But yeah, this particular week, it's not like we're 12 games and then there's like, oh, because there's 12 games, now there's 4 or 5 really attractive games, right? There aren't that many really attractive games. And then the really attractive games we have, Bills and Lions, right? Well, that's garnering really low ownership. And that could come back to bite people, right? But on paper, you're like, no, it makes sense that this is garnering low ownership, right? Josh Allen has only topped 30 points once since week 3, and that was last week, right? So who's to say he's going to repeat that this week? Khalil Shakir put up 24.6, I think, last week. And that's like the first time we've gotten a score from a pass catcher on the Bills that you would really want. And then obviously in the Lions, you got these price tags on Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. You know that that Amon-Ra St. Brown has typically seen these 6-7 targets. He's going to need a spike in volume there. So it's like, it makes sense that on paper, people are like, I don't want to pay the price tags on this. But yeah, that's kind of the nature of this week is those clear best teams and best game environments don't stand out for reasons of like salary cap or how these teams use their players. But then that's pushing us further down the risk curve to games that, you know, where people are going to express confidence in CJ Stroud or Justin Herbert or Anthony Richardson, whoever it might be. And that might come back to bite people as well, right? So I think that this slate's pretty wide open.
How do you think about that dynamic? Because obviously it came into play last week with the Josh Allen big game. And like you said, the ownership doesn't seem to be piling back in on this spot, even though it's two of the most, explosive offenses in football, could be a legitimate Super Bowl preview. And yet the salary constrictions don't make it easy to build. Does that make you want to, lean into a spot like that more?
Yeah, I mean, the salary constrictions and then also just the nature of how these teams have called their offenses and how these teams have distributed points to where you're really not getting that many high-end, like monster high-end scores. I think that the DFS, this speaks to the DFS field getting sharper, but maybe a little bit too sharp, right? In the past, you would have had a game like Bills and Rams and everybody would have been piling on Lions and Bills the next week. And I kind of wrote up 75% of my DFS interpretation write-up for this before looking at ownership. And so writing it up, expecting everybody to be piling in on this game and kind of saying, really, because of these factors, this game isn't as attractive. Then look at ownership and it's like, oh, nobody's on it. Like that does make it more interesting. And so, yeah, if there were some clear spots, if this slate also had Bengals and Ravens, right, or something like that, if it had Bengals against another really good offense, if it had a really good offense against the Ravens, if we had a setup like that, then we would have a situation where it's like, yeah, you can get away from this Bills-Lions game because there are these other games that could also shoot out, right? Ultimately, we're looking for the games that could just smash all the other games on the slate, which we got with Bills and Rams last week. If Bills Lions plays a 26-28 game, that's not winning us tournaments. The question is, can it play above that? And so because of the nature of this week where we move off of that, but then we move on to other things that really aren't that much better, it does kind of pull me back to a game like that where you say, okay, but isn't this a spot where we could just do something really differently? Isn't this a spot where we could play Jahmyr Gibbs or where we could play Amari Cooper, where we could play Josh Allen again? And just try to find a way to build differently around this slate where we're capturing as much upside as we can.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's interesting, last week, and obviously everything always looks obvious in hindsight, but you look at the Bills are built around Josh Allen. They don't have some alpha wide receiver. And the Rams right now are built around, Kyren and Puka. And it's like, oh, you just put the highest usage guys in and the best players in the best game environment and you win. You look at the Lions this week. And it seems harder to identify, right? They split the running back stuff. They, ARSB and Jamison Williams can kind of ping pong at times. Sam Laporta will pop up for a touchdown. So will Brock Wright. So it's like, it's not as clean as it is with the Rams.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was, I wrote up that Bills Rams game last week as like the way to play it is probably Josh Allen without a stacking partner and with a bring back, right? And you bring back Puka because against this heavy zone coverage, he's set up to do well. And that was exactly what we saw. Now, against this heavy zone coverage, Amon-Ra St. Brown's also set up to do well, but there's a greater question of volume. We know that that's how the Rams are going to try to win their games is going through, like you said, Puka and Kyren. And with the Lions, what makes them so good, what makes them so difficult for defenses to defend is they can do so many different things. And that really kind of hurts us as DFS players. So definitely not as straightforward of a game, but what we're looking for ultimately is those games that, and Squirrel Patrol and I talked about this last week on Solo Ship, where we were saying it's not going to surprise us if Sunday ends and Rams and Bills is the highest scoring game on the slate. It's not going to surprise us if Sunday ends. And what I said at the time was, it's not going to surprise if they combine for 60 plus points, right? Ended up being whatever it was, 86 combined points. But we're looking for games like that where it's like, okay, this game could ascend above everything else. And then ideally you kind of know where those points will shake out if that happens. So Bills and Lions could ascend above everything else, but I think it's a little bit less likely than last week's game. And you don't actually know where that production is shaking out on the Lions side. So, I mean, I think it's fair that this game is drawing lower ownership, is I guess what I'm getting at. But then when you realize that what you're moving onto is other games that also aren't that great, or other spots that also aren't that great, then that kind of opens things up to go a different direction. So I wouldn't say that Bills and Lions is my kind of top pivot on this slate. We're going to get to the quarterbacks that I like on this slate. There's a couple that I like on this slate, but that is one of these places where the way I'm going to be building this week is thinking about, okay, there's a lot of fragile chalk. There's going to be a lot of surprises among higher owned pieces. Some of them are going to hit, but there's also going to be a lot of higher owned pieces that don't hit. And so where can we gain that edge as a result of that?
Yeah, and just the usual reminder here as we transition to quarterback, we are recording this live at 1 p.m. Eastern on Friday. We do generally get a decent amount of news that trickles in. There are some pretty big Q tags this week. So if you're listening back to this in podcast form or later this weekend, just know that we work with the information we have available to us at the time. Also want to give a shout out here in the chat. We got Mathology gifted 10 memberships. JM, I don't know if you know about Mathology, but I'll tell you this. He had the #1 team in the Best Ball Mania regular season, the overall best team, just an absolute beauty, then wins a Dog Bowl ticket, goes down to the Dog Bowl and finishes in 6th place in the Dog Bowl. So Mathology is having quite the year here. And I'm going to have him on DFS After Dark on Saturday night. Had a lot of fun hanging with him in Dallas. So this is the luckiest guy and playing better than anyone I know right now, JM.
Yeah, the one of the funnest things about going to those live events is getting to connect with people, and you realize how many. I mean, we've had, over the years, these podcasts that we've done on OWS, where we just have a community member who's on a heater, come on and kind of talk about their process and what they're seeing, and you realize how many sharp people there are, kind of building up their bankroll or building a name for themselves in this space, and always cool to connect with those people and have those conversations, learn from them, and also speaking of these conversations, piggybacking off what you said before. Another component of this is that we're not necessarily using this show to just say who the sharpest plays are on the slate, right? You're gonna have projection systems for that. You have a lot of content for that deeper into the weekend, but also ideally, if you're listening to this, what you're picking up is some of the thought processes that go into how we're building rosters and how we're trying to win tournaments, because that's where we can really find our edge is less about finding the best players on the slate and more about how we play those players, how we think through things, how we take advantage of the uncertainty on a slate and all that.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to say, and I forgot to mention this about Mathology, because I remember when he won his Dog Bowl ticket, he was traveling, and Mathology's an OWS sub, and he was pouring through the OWS content for the week, and he won on a Justin Fields week. It was a Justin Fields stack. That's what qualified him. And he was talking about part of his process. He had all of his handwritten notes, and he does the because on the site, right, you can put your own community notes under there. So he was showing his notes for that game and saying, I'm playing this Justin Fields stack until it hits. So a fun Mathology story there.
Love it.
All right, let's dive into quarterback. Let's start at the top with the kind of the big guns as far as salary and projection. And none of these guys are actually pacing to be the most popular quarterbacks on the slate. I'll put the big four running back, Freudian slip there, running quarterbacks here: Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Jaden Daniels. And let's just also toss in Joe Burrow, who's playing out of his mind right now. What do you think about the top end quarterbacks this week?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair that none of these guys are garnering ownership. But then again, when we look at who is garnering ownership, when we look at how much uncertainty is inherent in the quarterbacks who are garnering ownership, when we look at how much uncertainty is inherent in the two quarterbacks that I'm kind of being drawn toward this week, that's where we start to say, okay, but couldn't this be another game where Josh Allen has to take over? Couldn't this be another 40-plus point game from Josh Allen? You know, it's not infrequent that you look through box scores and fantasy production box scores, right? And you see, like, we've seen it with Tua recently, like 23 points, 26 points, 28 points, and then like the rest of the time it's in the teens, right? You kind of see these little hot streaks where a quarterback the offense is leaning on him more, the quarterback is taking over more of the game or whatever it is, and there's like a streak of games where their points are higher and then it goes back to normal, right? Like, it's not going to be surprising if Josh Allen has a huge game in a second consecutive week in a spot where you would expect there to be a lot of points scored. Lamar Jackson, like, it's very viable that people are not on him. You could say, okay, the Ravens are probably going to make the playoffs, right? Probably going to make a deep playoff run. They're playing the Giants. how many hits do they want to expose Lamar Jackson to, right? The easy wins that the Ravens have had this year, Lamar Jackson has thrown the ball. It was like 22 and fewer times in those. He's had limited rush attempts in those games that the Ravens have absolutely controlled. And you would expect that here. So it's reasonable that people are not on Lamar Jackson, but then we can also ask that question. Really, if everybody's going to Will Levis this week, if everybody's going to Justin Herbert this week, where we may or may not have Ladd McConkey, if everybody's going to Anthony Richardson in a tough matchup, Drake May, what if Lamar Jackson ends up being called on to run the ball more than normal? What if he gets some rushing touchdowns? And the place where I'm really asking that question is Jalen Hurts, right? Because we know the volume's not going to be there for Jalen Hurts. We know it's a tough matchup, but like, aren't the Eagles still going to score 3 touchdowns in the spot? Probably. And then couldn't Jalen Hurts account for 2 or 3 of those on the ground? And so I do think that there's edge this week, or Jaden Daniels, who kind of all season has been like, oh, he's higher priced than he should be because he's not really going to put up a 35 to 40 pointer. But like, he is consistently putting up 25 points and above if he puts up a score like that in the spot. So yeah, I do think this is a week where, again, it makes a lot of sense that none of these guys are drawing ownership. But then when you recognize who is drawing ownership, there's a very strong component this week of saying, maybe I just want to build through bottom ownership projection players in a few spots, players who have tons of individual upside, and players who, could be those plays that at the end of the weekend, it's like, oh yeah, why weren't we thinking about that guy? And so, I think all these top 4. Burrow, I'm a little bit less interested in because I would expect, we know he's a pocket passer. Obviously he can throw for 4 or 5 touchdown passes, but I don't expect the Titans to be super competitive in this one, right? And you go through this whole season for Burrow, and it's like every game they play, they're playing against a team that's able to put up points against them and force this sort of back and forth thing from the Bengals. So could the Bengals just keep their foot on the gas, try to win by a bunch? I mean, the Titans have a good defense, right? Not a great defense, but a good defense. And then I don't think their offense can keep pace. So that's what I'm not arguing against, but I'm kind of less interested in it than these other top 4 where you got the rushing upside, the rushing touchdowns, all that.
Yeah, and my just little hunch is that Joe Burrow is actually going to come in higher than his projected ownership. Just like one little thing, I've been, doing the underdog drafts this week. People take him over Jaden Daniels, like the Jamar Chase drafter, like trips over themselves to take Joe Burrow like really early at every draft. So I see like lots of, positive sentiment on Joe Burrow, which makes sense. You look at this box score. I mean, he hasn't scored less than 25 points, over these past 5 weeks. So I get it there, but just a note that maybe that ownership could be light. Let's head down into this next tier. You have mentioned some of these names that are going to garner a little bit of interest. We're obviously kind of getting into that territory of more pocket passers. You have Jared Goff in that high scoring game. Baker Mayfield, who, flying a little bit under the radar after he didn't necessarily go off last week. You mentioned Stroud. There's Tua. There's Bo Nix. There's Kyler. What do you like kind of in this, 6 to 7K range?
Yeah, to me, Tua is the one who stands out the most. Just the nature of, we love to pay attention to the evolving nature of an offense. Teams are continually updating who they are as a team and who they are as an offense, basically through Thanksgiving. And then ideally by Thanksgiving, you know who you are, you know your identity, and you are calling your games to that identity down the stretch run. So what we've seen from the Bucs recently, for example, is a less heavy reliance on Baker ever since Chris Godwin went out. Before Chris Godwin got hurt, we were consistently seeing 45 plus pass attempts from Baker Mayfield. Since Chris Godwin's gotten hurt, it's 29 to 33 pass attempts in every game. We've gone 5 straight games without him topping 300 passing yards after he topped 303 out of 5, 4 to 5, whatever it was. And so we're seeing the Bucs kind of trend a different direction in how they're calling games, whereas the Dolphins are very much like in this mode of, okay, Tua's hot right now. It's not a lot of downfield passing. It's a lot. We're seeing this 40 attempts, 317 yards, 46 attempts, 365, 47 attempts, 331, 7 yards per attempt, 7.9, 7.98. But it's consistently how they're moving the ball through this offense. And then, the Texans technically have a good run defense and a good pass defense, but it's really their run defense that's a little bit more ferocious. And so I would expect the Dolphins, who do still have a path to the playoffs, to continue to kind of lean on this heater that Tua is on right now and just say, hey, let's keep having him drop back. Let's keep having him throw the ball. I mean, he's on 28, 36, 40, 46, 47 pass attempts every week, more pass attempts. That doesn't mean that's going to happen this week, but he is going to kind of keep pushing up for these like 35 plus pass attempts. And so he's the guy who really stands out to me down here. And I don't have strong arguments against some of the other guys who are going to draw ownership. I guess I think CJ Stroud's probably going to end up being projections driven as opposed to somebody people are actually going to go out of their way to play. So won't kind of bother talking him down. Kyler Murray, we know that the upside's there. So I don't mind the Kyler Murray play. Justin Herbert, we know how good he is, and they play in Tampa where typically you have to throw the ball a little bit more. So I don't mind that one. I kind of think that the Chargers will be able to mute this game environment with their defense, as they've done in all but 2 games this year. And that'll kind of prevent Herbert from having the big game, is how I'm seeing it, right? I do have a problem with Anthony Richardson, just because you're talking about one of the top defenses in football. And but again, Anthony Richardson, similar to the Jalen Hurts thing, and it's a tough matchup, but couldn't he hit the rushing touchdowns, right? So clear arguments against him. The teams he obviously hit against the Jets, who've been kind of up and down on defense, then hit against the Patriots. But yeah, it's kind of like it's thin down here, right? I think that Tua comes with the fewest question marks out of all these guys. Doesn't mean he's going to perform at the highest level. And that's kind of where I start realizing, okay, yeah, Tua's my favorite of this group. Also, he might underperform. And so don't we want to be thinking about some other things as well on this slate?
Yeah, and I guess not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but just because the offense is both condensed, but makes it, necessarily a little hard to know between Achane, Tyreek, Waddle, and Jonnu. Do you have preferences on how you'd like to play to, or do you just kind of want exposure to him in every direction?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's double stacks, and then you kind of have to guess, because we don't have, last year it was like you're seeing Tua throw it 33 times and Tyreek Hill seeing 14 targets. And now it's like Tua is throwing 40 times and Tyreek Hill, last week, 14 targets on 47 pass attempts from Tua, but it's much more of a spread the wealth type of offense at this point. And so it's less confident who's going to hit, but it's pretty confident that 2 of these guys would be likely to hit if Tua is hitting, because now it's not this. Last year it was like the Tua doubles didn't make sense all that often because he wasn't throwing enough, and it was so concentrated and basically concentrated on Tyreek Hill. And now it's like more volume from Tua, but spread out to more guys. And so these Tua doubles really come into play. And you mentioned Achane in there, right? It's like Achane is as much a part of this mix as Jonnu, as Waddle. But what we do know is I think it's 3 of the last 4 games for Tua that the right Tua double would have kept you on a 200-point pace. And so, you got to guess, but this is certainly one of the higher probability guessing spots that we have.
All right. One of these quarterbacks we're going to save for the lineup build. If you saw the thumbnail, you might be able to guess who it is. If not, you can wait with bated breath here for another 20 or 30 minutes. 2 other guys I just want to hit on who kind of looked decent to me. Both have a little bit of rushing juice here. Bo Nix at 6,300 versus the Colts, and then Kyler Murray, at home versus this Patriots defense here, who have given up a lot of big plays through the passing game. Any love for those guys?
Yeah, probably less Bo Nix than Kyler Murray, only because Bo Nix, I think, would require a game environment that's kind of forcing him. Obviously, he had this big game against Atlanta, big game against Carolina. I don't think that the Indianapolis defense is Atlanta or Carolina, right? Indianapolis was a team we were attacking early in the year, but this is a team that a Gus Bradley type of defense where it primarily relies on communication. You often see those teams have more breakdowns early in the season and then get things going as they move deeper into the season. They're used to understanding their responsibilities, how they move on a string together, all that. So we've seen Indianapolis kind of give some teams not problems, but certainly create muted game environments. And so Bo Nix, I'm not as excited about his opportunity for a big game. He's obviously capable of it. Kyler Murray, I don't think that the matchup is an issue at all. The big issue is we know that Arizona likes to play through their ground game. And these games where their offense does poorly are typically games where they're not being able to run the ball. They should be able to run the ball here, which means their whole offense should function. But then it's a question of how much do they need the passing attack side of things to function as they move deeper into this game. So, I don't have a problem with the Kyler play. Looks like he's on track to be the highest owned quarterback on the slate. And it won't surprise me if it ends up that way. So, do I think that his ownership matches the probability of him hitting a tournament winner? No. But I think he's a perfectly fine play. I would prefer to get different at this spot myself, just because I think that there's edge over time on this slate with so much weakness at the top of ownership projections. I think there's edge over time on just saying, okay, well, I don't want to just flock to kind of the mediocre play that everybody's on. I'll go to the mediocre play that people are not on. But that is how I see the slate, right? It's a lot of kind of C+, C plays, maybe some B- plays, and really no A+ plays at the quarterback position.
Yeah, I'll give a little note for my underdog peeps. If you want exposure to Kyler Murray, go do it on underdog. He's barely ever drafted. So you can go get him at 0% ownership here, or you could play him as the most popular quarterback on DraftKings. All right, let's head over to running back. We have at the high end here, Barkley back on the slate. It is so funny. Like he had 130 some rushing yards last week, like a really good game, but we had such sky high expectations for him that it somehow felt like a flop. I guess relative to a salary, it was a little bit of a flop. But thoughts on Barkley, Henry? I think they definitely stand out as far as what I'm seeing from what people want to do in drafts this week.
Yeah, I mean, Henry obviously has a much better, dramatically better matchup. I don't know how much we really worry about that with Saquon, though. The issue, obviously, for Saquon, it's less about Pittsburgh being really tough on the ground. They're okay on the ground, and more about just like overall scoring being muted, right? Because you typically still need drives from an offense in order to put something together, and they'll have a harder time driving against Pittsburgh. So yeah, it's Henry above Saquon for me, but it won't surprise me if either of them goes for 30, 35 plus on this particular week. And really can't count out either of these guys, but Henry, we can typically see like the spots where he's going to hit a little bit more. I mean, Saquon, my two heaviest exposure weeks in him were against Dallas and against Carolina, which were his two softest matchups of the year, right? And he flopped against Dallas and disappointed against Carolina. And so that's just kind of the nature of, against Carolina, the average, I think, was 6.4 yards per carry without any monster runs. So it's like, it was easy for him. It's just, he didn't get enough of the carries, right? Carolina kind of controlled the ball in that game, and he didn't get the touchdowns. He didn't get any catches, and they just weren't able to pile up carries the way that they sometimes are able to. And so you just go back to the well and realize, like, Saquon, you don't worry too much about game environment, too much about matchup. So yeah, I like both these guys. Henry over Saquon for me in terms of what stands out on paper, but totally fine playing either guy.
I think the other guys up here, just kind of raw projection, that are in interesting spots this week. Obviously, we talked about Achane. You like that game environment. He's pricey at 7,900 though. Joe Mixon in that same game. Chase Brown, who is still probably underpriced relative to the role he's taken on. Any thoughts on those guys in the upper sevens there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Achane, I would never count him out for like a 30-point game. I don't think I'm penciling in any of these other guys for like high probabilities of 30 points, whether it's Mixon, Kamara, Jahmyr Gibbs, Chase Brown, David Montgomery. So none of these guys are guys I'm really drawn toward at cost. At the same time, this isn't guaranteed to be a week like last week where we're seeing 40 pointers across the board, right? Most of this season, if you got 22 to 26 points from a player, you were in pretty good shape, and we could easily fall right back to that this week. And so, I mean, any of these guys could put up that type of score. I think that Chase Brown is the likeliest of this bunch to put up that like 25-point score. To me, he's not a guy that I'm going out of my way to play at cost, but I think he's a perfectly fine play. Behind him, I think that Gibbs in particular is very interesting because he's going to be so low owned and has such high individual upside. And so like on paper, Chase Brown is a better play, but in terms of what makes you the most money over time on this slate, probably Jahmyr Gibbs does. And then I think Mixon's viable. The thing with Mixon is he's not going to hit, it's kind of like James Conner. He's not going to hit explosive breakaway runs. So what you need is consistent production and touchdowns. And so the question is just, can this offense be consistent enough against a Miami defense that's been really good against the pass this year? Can they be consistent enough on offense for Mixon to get, enough of these 6, 7, 8, 12-yard plays to get the touchdown opportunities in order to put a big game? So kind of a wide range of outcomes on Mixon, but wouldn't surprise me if he put up, 25 to 30 as well. And also, this is like, I would be a little bit annoyed listening to me this week because it's like, hey, you seem kind of lukewarm on everybody. And that's kind of the nature of the slate, right? Is like, you're kind of lukewarm on everybody. And so you're kind of looking for these places where it's like, what's the best play on paper or what's marginally better than another play, but what's the edge on the slate? So like the Jahmyr Gibbs thing where it's like, yeah, but what's going to make you the most money over time playing Jahmyr Gibbs at 3% ownership where, he's not a significant underdog to Chase Brown, who's going to be much higher owned.
Yeah. And I guess one other question to kind of fast forward is, what are you seeing as far as value on this slate? And maybe this is a sneak peek into wide receiver and tight end, because that can often inform, what we're needing to do at running back as far as, are we paying down here or can we afford to get up to the Derrick Henrys of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can afford to get up. You've got guys like Keon Coleman or Xavier Legette. If Ladd McConkey's out, you got Josh Palmer, guys who have like real roles in this 4K price range. And then when we get down to the 3K price range, we're where we should be at this point in the season, which is where nothing really stands out in terms of projections, but there are guys down here who are capable of hitting, right? Sterling Shepard might not play. Jalen McMillan saw 7 or 8 targets last week. I mean, they're still trying to bring him along. He's viable. Marvin Mims, getting these snaps out of the backfield as well as at wide receiver, finally getting some scheme touches, capable of scoring from anywhere on the field. You have the Patriots wideouts available this week. There's a few others available this week where it's like, yeah, it's not great value, but this is the type of value that we typically have at this point in the season where you take one of these guys, you hope you get the 20-pointer because that puts you way ahead of the field. But if you don't, that's pretty standard at this point, right? But you're trying to fit in your highest upside plays at other spots. So there's not strong clear value, but that's actually kind of an edge at this point in the season because people get scared to gravitate toward that type of value.
Let me ask you about some of these 6K running backs, kind of just looking at projected ownership. It seems like this is where the field is primarily going to gravitate. Chuba Hubbard at 6,500. Obviously, no Jonathan Brooks. Good matchup. On the other side there, you have Rico Dowdle coming off of a big game there. He's 6,100. You can include James Conner in there at 6,600. And then I think you can also include Brian Robinson at 6,200. Good matchup. No Austin Eckler. So thoughts on that 6K range?
Yeah, I'd say Brian Robinson, least interesting of the bunch to me, only because he has 1 game all year over 18 touches, 2 games all year over 17 touches. And I don't think that Austin Eckler being out changes his touch projection. They still have Jeremy McNichols. They still have Chris Rodriguez?
Rodriguez.
And so, they're going to give touches to, I would expect them to give touches to other guys. I mean, they're in the thick of the playoff hunt. They've obviously been trying to preserve Brian Robinson Jr.'s body all year. While limiting his touches. Rico Dowdle and Chuba Hubbard were the two who stood out to me the most with kind of like, I don't mind James Conner. I don't mind Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard, he's hit this year in games Tennessee won or last week that they were leading the whole time. And so are they going to do that against Cincinnati? That's kind of the bet that you're probably placing on Pollard. But yeah, I don't mind those two guys, Conner and Pollard. On paper, definitely Rico and Chuba are the best plays kind of in this price range. And in terms of even just bang for your buck, they're the 2 best running back plays on the slate. I mean, it's justifiable on paper that these guys are going to be the 2 highest owned running backs. But then this also is one of these spots where it's like, don't you ask the question, like, would it surprise us if Sunday ends and Rico Dowdle put up 12 points, right? Like, would it surprise us if Sunday ends and Chuba Hubbard put up 17 points? It probably shouldn't. Cowboys defense has been playing a lot better recently. And obviously the Panthers defense has been playing a lot better recently. Cowboys have Cooper Rush at quarterback. So yeah, I think that this is sharp chalk in the context of the slate. If I go through the slate and just say, who are the best on paper plays? These are the 2 guys who stood out at running back. But then when you look and you're like, man, they're going to be the highest owned. It's Chuba Hubbard and Rico Dowdle. That's where this strategy angle starts to come in of maybe I do something different here, and I'm probably going to be a little bit different at quarterback and pass catchers because I like these double stacks and triple stacks we're going to get to as we get to the block party that people just won't be on. So I could justify playing Hubbard and Rico Dowdle on those rosters, right? And just be chalky. That's okay strategically. But even with that, it's like, it's still kind of fragile chalk in the context of what we sometimes have. And so I wouldn't mind going off the board, going up to, not that Derrick Henry is going to be low owned, but lower owned, or even going up to a Jahmyr Gibbs where you're just doing something really different from the field.
Let's see here as far as maybe some cheaper guys or off the board plays. One big domino that we're going to have to see is this Bucky Irving situation. Didn't practice this week. I believe just officially got the Q tag, so they're not ruling him out. Obviously, Rachaad White, who we've mentioned on a lot of shows this year, would be in an incredible spot if Bucky Irving didn't play. Any thoughts on the Bucs backfield and then kind of maybe some other cheapies here under 6K?
Yeah, it's Rachaad White's the cheapie who stands out as like capable of we talked about this last week. I mean, you don't want to save 1K for a guy who's like a dramatically lesser play than the guy who's 1K more, right? 1K in salary, you can figure that out. You can pile up several different 1K savings onto like getting that one cheap with upside guy, right? And that allows you flexibility to get to these other guys. So typically when you get below the 6K price range at running back, 5,900 this week, we could say, because Ramondre is a decent, volume play. But typically when you get below there, you're kind of in a different tier of running backs. Rachaad White's in this same tier as these 6K guys, and Bucky Irving's out. The one concern there would be, do we trust the Bucs to give all the touches to Rachaad White again, or does Sean Tucker kind of emerge randomly with a bigger role this week? So last week, Bucky Irving played 10 snaps early in the game, and they were like, all right, the hip, we're sitting him out the rest of the game. The rest of the way, Rachaad White, 47 snaps, and Sean Tucker, 11. So it was definitely Rachaad White's backfield last week. I don't know that guarantees that it's Rachaad White's backfield this week, but I would expect it to be. Not a great matchup, but because of his pass game involvement, because of how central he is to this offense, and because of how well schemed this offense is, I still think he's a really interesting play this week.
I guess maybe one other kind of backfield that's interesting to me is just, this Jets backfield without Breece Hall. We saw Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis get work in the passing game. Isaiah Davis kind of stole his thunder a little bit there. Any love for them? Because they're in a really good matchup against Jacksonville here.
Yeah, I mean, they split running backs. I mean, they split snaps like exactly down the middle. It was like 37-36 or something like that. And so you were talking about a true split backfield. And you're talking about like, I could pay $1,000 more and get Rico Dowdle, who's kind of got the backfield to himself now. I could pay $1,500 more and get Chuba Hubbard, who does have the backfield to himself. So yeah, I mean, I can see these plays. There are probably other places I'd prefer to save salary, but I can see the plays.
Any other running backs I haven't asked you about that you think are worth bringing up before we head over to wide receiver here?
No, I mean, my running back pool, like my actual running back pool is pretty small. It's Chuba and Dowdle and Derrick Henry and Devon Achane. Like those are the four guys that I'm like, I like these guys on paper. And then beyond that, it goes to, okay, there's some other interesting ways that we could go this week. So, and then there's kind of the guys that I'm not arguing against, right? The Chase Browns and the Joe Mixons, where it's like, no, I'm totally fine with people playing those guys. But I do think that this is an interesting week to be like, well, if you got a small running back pool and if it's kind of fragile to begin with, maybe you go to fragile plays that nobody's on. I do think there's edge this week and just thinking strategically instead of thinking about who are the plays I really like the most myself.
All right, before we talk wide receiver, got to let you guys know about what we got going on over at 1 Week Season. We still have the 70% off promo code Pete70 will get you 70% off your rest of season Inner Circle and DFS subs over there, and also carry you through the playoffs. Very strong value here if you want to get a little Christmas gift, holiday gift, and have been waiting to check out the site. Jam, let people know what you guys got going on over there this week, or if it's just business as usual.
Business as usual. My player grid will be up this evening. Like I said, kind of a different structure this week. I'm going to break down the positions by players I like, players I don't dislike, and then some alternate angles. And so instead of going kind of with my blue chip and light blue chip and bonus plays and build rounds and all that, we're going to do something a little different this week because of this is being a different, type of slate this week. And then throughout Saturday, all of our strategy and player pool content will roll in on the scroll. We'll have Lord Reeves and Hilo already recorded Searching for Ceiling. Squirrel Patrol and I will be doing Solo Ship, Angles Podcast, the slate tomorrow for Inner Circle members. So all that good stuff coming out throughout the weekend, getting you ready for the slate in terms of player pool, but also more importantly in terms of the potential strategy to win on this slate.
All right, let's head over to wide receiver now. We have, Jamar Chase at the top coming off of a monster game on Monday Night Football, 48 DraftKings points. Nico Collins here, A.J. Brown, the squeaky wheel, Amon-Ra in that high-profile shootout. You already mentioned Tyreek Hill as part of maybe Tua stacks. What do you like here at the high end of wide receiver?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could justify not playing any of these top end guys, right? You could justify, Jamar Chase and T. Higgins currently tracking to be the two highest owned wide receivers, against a Tennessee team that I'm not really that worried about the fact that they're good against wide receivers, but a Tennessee team that is good against wide receivers. And more importantly, frankly, just probably doesn't keep this game super competitive, or at least doesn't turn this into a high scoring back and forth affair like we've seen so many times against the Bengals this year. So you could certainly justify moving off of them. Nico Collins, obviously really tough matchup against this Miami secondary. A.J. Brown in a spot where we know the Eagles aren't throwing the ball to begin with, and then they're playing this Pittsburgh defense. And so, and then of course, Amon-Ra St. Brown, where you're really betting on this game playing out a very particular way for him to see the volume that he needs in order to hit. So yeah, I think you could justify not being on any of these guys, even Tyreek Hill. He's priced appropriately or maybe even underpriced for the ceiling, but obviously in terms of kind of the change in usage throughout most of this year might be a little bit overpriced for his typical role. So you could certainly justify moving off these top guys. You could also make a case for some of these top guys. So Tyreek Hill, sharpest of the bunch. And then next for me would probably be Amon-Ra St. Brown. Then Jamar Chase, then Nico Collins, and then AJ Brown at the bottom of that group. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I see the top of the wide receiver position.
And I think I asked you this last week, but I always think it's kind of a helpful way to frame it because I know the way you play and the way you think about this, a lot of these guys, if you're playing into that game environment or with their quarterback, it often makes sense. But I think I asked you, like, which of these guys would be the ones you'd be willing to use as a one-off? And it sounds like, you have a stomach for some of it, but you're not going out of your way to jam one of these as a one-off.
Right. Yeah. Because if Tyreek Hill's hitting, because of the nature of how Miami's been running that offense and then what Tua's price tag is, like I probably want Tua on that roster because if I'm getting Tyreek Hill right, I'm probably getting Tua right. So I like Tyreek, but probably only playing it with Tua, right? And so if I'm going one off from this group, Jamar Chase is totally fine. Amon-Ra St. Brown, totally fine. Nico Collins, totally fine. But again, all of them require things to really break their way for them to put up that 30+ point score on this particular week. So none of them were guys where I'm like, oh, I've got to carve out the salary for this guy, which, that doesn't always work. Last week that was Saquon, right? It was like, I got to carve out the salary for Saquon. And sometimes that just doesn't work. And the other guys who you're not carving out the salary for are the ones who end up hitting. But yeah, just in terms of like what stands out on paper, to me, it's not any of these guys as priorities for me.
Let's go down to this next tier. It includes the Jets wide receivers. You got Mike Evans with the Q tag. You got Neighbors with the Q tag against that Ravens secondary, although they have a really low team total. Kind of curious your thoughts there. CeeDee Lamb, what do you think about this next tier? Courtland Sutton we can put in there.
Yeah, this is just the point in the season we're at, right? You got Cooper Rush throwing to CeeDee Lamb. You've got Tommy DeVito throwing to Malik Neighbors. This tier to me, Sutton stands out the most, which doesn't come as a surprise. He's kind of the guy who's drawing the most ownership from this group outside of T. Higgins. But yeah, I mean, just the nature of his role, the consistency of his role, and the fact that they're willing to be a little bit of aggressive with him. And we see the 70+ yards, and I believe it's 5 straight games, maybe it's 6 straight games. It's actually it is 6 straight games, and then 97+ in 3 of these games. And so, Courtland Sutton seeing the targets, seeing a downfield role. He's got a good connection with Bo Nix, and it's a good matchup. And we would expect Denver to continue passing deep into this game. So I think from a floor ceiling standpoint, he stands out the most. In terms of just like who actually puts up the highest score, though, it could be any of these guys, right? The thing with Davante Adams and Garrett Wilson is, are they likely to put up a big score? No, right? But both of them, it's like, well, there's going to be 8+ targets for both of them, probably for Davante Adams, double-digit targets. And then it's a question of, do they score multiple touchdowns or do they break off one long play? Because one long play goes from like 7 catches for 75 yards to all of a sudden they're putting up over 100 yards. And so both these guys are in the mix. I'm also kind of curious. We haven't seen Rodgers in this situation where their season's over. They're out of playoff contention. They've got 4 games left. It's pretty clear that Rodgers won't be with the Jets next year. Probably Davante Adams won't be. Maybe Garrett Wilson won't be. Like, do they just kind of go throw a party and try to pile up some stats? That's not really in Rodgers' nature, but we've also not seen Rodgers in this situation before. And so I do think this is one of those interesting spots, Lions against the Jags a few weeks ago, where it's like, oh, the Jets should control this game. And so the Jets will call the game this way. And it's like, what if they don't? What if they're just like, let's keep throwing, like whatever, let's get everybody touchdowns and have a big game here. So I do think that Adams and Garrett Wilson are interesting when you kind of think outside the box, think creatively about how this game could play out. That's one of those spots where it's like, oh, this could play out in kind of an interesting type of way.
Down as we get further here, someone in the chat mentioning Zay Flowers there. If you want to play it through the passing game, you mentioned Khalil Shakur earlier, finally popped up for a big game in that shootout last week. Ladd McConkey, who looks like he'll be popular if he goes. We still got the Q tag on him. Obviously didn't play last week. Calvin Ridley, not in a bad spot here. Unfortunately, his quarterback is Will Levis. Any interesting notes about these guys?
Yeah, I think Ladd McConkey's sharp chalk at cost. He's being used downfield, or at least in the intermediate areas, and it's really just a question of volume, right? If he's seeing 9-10 targets, he's got a clear shot at 20+ points. If he's seeing shy of that, his role doesn't really lend itself to him scoring 20+ points. But against Tampa, you would typically expect that. I do think that there's more volatility here in this projection than people are probably accounting for, in that we're relying on Greg Roman and Harbaugh to call this game the way that we expect them to call this game in order for Ladd McConkey to see those targets. Similar to Calvin Ridley, we're looking for Calvin Ridley to be fed targets in an effective manner by Will Levis. And so I can see the popularity on Ladd McConkey. I can see the popularity on Calvin Ridley. I also see those being spots that are kind of a little bit more volatile than the typical chalk we would like. And usually when there's volatility, we want to embrace it at low ownership and shy away from it at high ownership. So I think you could kind of just kind of put that blanket statement out there for yourself this week of like, is there high ownership with volatility? Okay, I'll move away. But then that's a lot of the high owned spots. And so I don't mind settling on some of these guys. Certainly prefer Ladd McConkey. Like I prefer a really good quarterback and a really good wide receiver where you're relying on the coaches calling things the way that you need them to, as opposed to relying on a bad quarterback in Will Levis and an inconsistent wide receiver in Calvin Ridley at high ownership. And so again, this is more about the strategy and what creates the highest expected value over time and less about who's the better play on paper. They're both solid plays. They're both kind of B- C+ plays on paper. And that's kind of the best that we have at the positions. But then recognizing that they both come with volatility and how that volatility is created and where we can gain the most edge. That's how I see it.
A couple things impacted by news, Jam. We actually did just get one that I know is going to impact our final segment. Cedric Tillman is not going to play this week, listed out officially here with a concussion. David Njoku not practicing, but officially listed as questionable. I think we can maybe cross that bridge when we get there as we continue to leak out spoilers about who the block party is going to be. I do have to ask as well about Brian Thomas Jr. 5,800. Evan Ingram was shut down for the year earlier this morning. Brian Thomas already getting about as many targets as he can handle, but any thoughts on Brian Thomas? And I also, someone in the chat mentioning we have to bring him up because his usage is absurd right now. Adam Thielen, I'm actually kind of surprised he doesn't have a higher ownership projection coming off of last week, but thoughts on any of those guys or situations?
Yeah, Brian Thomas Jr. is not for me with Mac Jones throwing him the ball against the Jets. If he hits, he hits. Adam Thielen, so you watch those games, and I've actually watched all these Carolina games just to kind of watch this Bryce Young thing unfold and be aware of everything that's going on with it. A lot of these targets are not schemed targets. It's kind of out of structure. It's the Panthers are trying to come back at the end or put together this drive at the end. And Adam Thielen's getting open as Bryce Young's kind of looking for something to develop. And so in a game where I don't know that I'm expecting, look how good the Panthers have been recently, right? They took the Chiefs down to this last second field goal. They should have beat the Bucs in overtime if not for that Chuba Hubbard fumble. Should have beat the Eagles if Xavier Legette had been able to hold on to that pass. And so, this is a team that's been playing really well lately, and they're playing the Cowboys now. They're actually favored in this game against the Cowboys. So I don't know that I see this being the type of game where we get those Bryce Young out of structure type of setup, or that Bryce Young out of structure type of setup, like down the stretch run of the game. And so, I don't mind Thielen, but he's not really standing out to me. I would expect that this is a week where we see more like 7-8 targets, which the nature of his targets, especially in structure, doesn't really lend itself to a big game. But that's also one of those where it's like, I can lay out these logical components, and I don't want somebody. I remember one week long ago when somebody showed me their roster right before kickoff. I went to watch games with a bunch of friends, and he had Giovanni Bernard at running back. And I was like, why are you playing Giovanni Bernard? Like, there's so many other good running backs, and like his role is so inconsistent. He was like, yeah, you're right. And he went and changed it. And then like Gio put up a 30+ point game because that's just kind of the nature of how these things can happen, right? So Adam Thielen's one of these guys who, I don't think that my logic should talk you off him if you like him, because he's not a logic play. It's like, oh, maybe he hits, right? But I think it's important to recognize that he's not a logic play. He's not a play where you're like, okay, because of the nature of this game and how they're going to use him, he's going to have a big game. It's like, no, he probably won't, but he can. And so that's kind of where Adam Thielen falls for me.
Let's go sub 5K. You did kind of run through a few of these when I was asking you earlier about if we had any running back value on the slate. Again, some of this is injury dependent. The Ladd stuff could open things up with QJ and Palmer. I believe you mentioned Legette. We have the Sterling Shepard Q tag. You mentioned that for McMillan. Anything you specifically want to highlight? Maybe that's not injury dependent for wide receiver value.
Yeah, Patriots wide receivers in terms of, we had the Kayshon Boutte chalk week. We had the Kendrick Bourne chalk week. And then they didn't hit on the chalk weeks. And so everybody's kind of moved off of them completely. Like they're still here. They're still in the same roles. The Patriots have actually been one of the pass heaviest teams over the last 5 weeks, over the last month and a half, it's been like top 6 in first half pass rate, like top 6 in situation neutral pass rate, top 3 or 4 in pass rate inside the 20. And so, yeah, I mean, the Patriots are throwing the ball, and these are the weapons: Demario Douglas and Hunter Henry. They got rid of KJ Osborne, Jalen Polk's not really involved. So it's Booty and Bourne and Demario Douglas and Hunter Henry. So I think that these guys, if you're looking for salary savers, actually make quite a bit of sense because you have projectable volume on these guys. Troy Franklin and Marvin Mims, both capable of scoring from anywhere on the field, both going to see 4 to 5 targets. So they basically fit into this bucket that we're typically looking at this point in the year of who's a cheap guy with upside that's not projectable, but can open up salary and can score 15 to 20 points. And if they do it, nobody's on them, and probably nobody else in this price range scores like that. And so you're way ahead of the field. When you get these, like some of my biggest weekends have been, you get that 3K, 3,500 receiver who scores 20 points at sub 1% ownership, and nobody else below 4K is scoring anywhere close to that. And that's just like a free leapfrog for your roster that you're so far ahead of everybody else because nobody has that guy. Nobody else is getting those points. And you're able to have a different salary structure as well as a result of that. So, yeah, I think that looking for guys like that this week is also, there's some value in that.
Yeah, I tried that a little bit last week with Kevin Austin on the Saints. Kind of like that idea of like
he ended up breaking Derek Carr's hands. So
yeah, exactly.
He got in there.
Any other wide receivers I haven't specifically asked you about? I know we're going to talk about the Browns here when we get to the building block, and we can dissect how the Tillman stuff affects that. But any other names I didn't hit on up here?
No, none that we outside of the Browns. No others that I want to make sure we touch on.
Okay, perfect. All right, let's move over to tight end. As always, I'll set the table like I always do, Jam, on a scale of 1 to 10. How excited are you to talk about the tight end position this week?
1.5, maybe.
Oh no, that's sad. No Brock Bowers on this slate.
Yeah, we're looking at
like
almost 50% ownership right now on Trey McBride and Stone Smart. So it's like you're either paying all the way up or all the way down is how people are approaching this.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, what are thoughts on that? Obviously, McBride, people are going to gravitate to him because he kind of feels like one of the only, bankable things on the slate. Although worth mentioning, he has the Q tag. I think he's going to be fine. But I wonder if that keeps his ownership relatively in check. Also, completely allergic to the end zone. So there's that. Stone Smart at near the Stone Min. Good chalk, bad chalk on those guys.
Week 15 chalk,
That's the politician answer right there, Jam.
If you're like just grinding research and thinking inside that box, you come out of it thinking Stone Smart's one of the sharper plays on the slate. Trey McBride's a perfectly fine play. And then you look at ownership and you're like, boy, these are going to be the highest owned guys. And they're like perfectly fine. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that they're on paper, they stand out when you kind of grind the research, and projection systems are going to shoot out the same thing. But it's pretty fragile, right? And so I'm not super scared of Stone Smart putting up a score that I couldn't win without, Yeah. And so it's a position where I don't mind doing things differently. Now, obviously, if my two main quarterbacks are Jameis and Tua, well, that pulls tight ends in, right? If David Njoku plays, that pulls Njoku in. Obviously, Jonnu Smith, that can pull him in on those Tua doubles. And that covers some of my tight end exposure right there. But yeah, I mean, other guys who are viable, you realize how thin it is, right? You're looking at like Zach Ertz, who's allergic to 20-point scores. You're looking at Hunter Henry, who's playing a defense that's been really good against tight ends. You're looking at Jake Ferguson, against Carolina. There's not a lot that stands out as like, oh, I really want to play this week. So I get it. I get the fact that people are looking at things like that. But again, this is a week where if all the chalk is C minus, C plus chalk, maybe we win by doing something that's not the chalk and recognizing that, hey, this is also a C play, but so is the play that everybody else is on. And it's, marginally worse, but the play that everybody's on isn't that great to begin with.
Right. And I'm sitting here, looking at Evan Ingram out. We've seen Brenton Strange, step in for him a few times, earn targets. It's like, is he that much worse of a play compared to Stone Smart? The projection might be like 1.5 points different, and you're going to get it at, a third of the ownership, a fourth of the ownership potentially. So That seems smart. You mentioned the Dolphins love. I assume Jonnu is a part of that, even though he's a little pricey.
Yeah. I mean, Johnny, obviously last week was weird. He saw no targets in regulation, and then in overtime sees 3 targets and gets the game-winning touchdown. But before that, he was kind of the reason why Tyreek Hill wasn't seeing the targets that we're used to Tyreek Hill seeing, because we got 11, 8. Like, he's been an emphasized part of this offense. So yeah, Jonnu Smith, because of what he can do from a schemed targets perspective, it's a guy that we've been chasing for years since he was at the Titans on weeks where it's like, I think they're going to scheme him some looks. And recently the Dolphins have been scheming him some looks. So he's part of the like Tua doubles. And then I probably don't play him away from those rosters, but yeah, very much in the mix. Travis Kelce's in the mix, especially if you think that Cleveland can score points in this game, because Kansas City's going to have to do something in response. I think people are sour on Kelce again at this point. So yeah, there's definitely different ways that you could go here. And you mentioned, right, we can get to other cheap tight ends as well. So whether that's Juwan Johnson, whether that's Dalton Schultz, who put up 17 points last time out, and still capable of putting up a good game against the Miami defense, it's kind of shut down against wide receivers. You've got Jatavian Sanders back. You've got Chigo Okonkwo. You've got Jordan Aiken stepping in. So yeah, the Stone Smart is not the only place to save salary this week either.
All right. I think that's enough of the tight end. When Jam gives it a score under 2, I am not going to make this too painful for him. Let's hop over now and do what we always do to wrap up the show, build a team here on DraftKings. All right. We got the Deposit Kingdom Weekly League for Week 15. We had to shrink it a little bit. Interest is waning at DFS here.
Win the season.
Yeah, at that point, we're down to 800 entries here. 492 of you have already joined us. I do exclusively post this link in the Deposit Kingdom Discord. We got 1,200 up top, $10 entry, 3 max tournament, completely rake free. Very good tournament here. You go into the Deposit Kingdom Discord. There's a link in the show notes down below if you haven't ventured in there. And then you go to the announcement section. You'll find this link. You can hop in, compete with us, and then I will review the winning lineups on the Monday Portfolio Review show, which is every Monday at 10 a.m. Eastern. Jam, you teased it with the cover boy. We teased it throughout the show. We had a piece of news that might be impacting where you want to go here. Set the table for everyone for this week's block.
This is the blessed to be here block with Jameis Winston and 3 pass catchers. So we'll have to talk about who the 3 pass catchers are going to be here in a moment, but really quickly, just to run through this. So Jameis Winston, he's had these, 6 starts so far this year. And 2 of them were against the Steelers. One of them was in the snow. And one of them was against this really good Chargers pass defense. So every game except Steelers in the snow has been 40-plus pass attempts from Jameis Winston. So pretty good shot that we see 40-plus pass attempts in this one. And in the 3 games where he hit, and this is what's really interesting, right? Like people are excited about playing Judy. People were playing Judy last week. In the 3 games where Jameis hit, 3 pass catchers hit alongside him. So one of them, it was Tillman, Elijah Moore, Njoku. 2 of them, it was Judy, Elijah Moore, and Njoku. In 2 of those games, Jameis triples would have kept you on a 218-point pace. That's absurd. That's wacky. That's unbelievable. And the other game, it was like a 292-point pace. Now, we're not expecting that. That was the game against Denver, but that's 3 out of 6 games. That's a 50% hit rate covering 4 spots on your roster at a 218-point pace. Now, the next thing that people think of here is they're like, obviously, low implied team total. We actually like that on a week where it's like everything is kind of a C+, C- option. Okay, low implied team total, that keeps people off of this. I think the next thing people think of is like, yeah, but it's the Kansas City defense. Do we really want to attack the Kansas City defense? So, Pete, this is nuts. In terms of DVOA, this is the softest pass defense that Jameis has faced so far. So the Steelers are, I believe the Steelers are 8th in DVOA against the pass. He's faced them twice. The Chargers are, I think, 6th. And then these other teams, New Orleans and Baltimore, for all the flack that they get, they're both top 16 in DVOA against the pass. Denver's obviously a top defense in DVOA against the pass. So he's played all top half of the league defenses so far. Kansas City 17th in DVOA this year against the pass. They're not the elite unit that they've been in recent seasons. And, basically in line with what Baltimore has been against the pass this year. So I think that people are going to look at this matchup and think, well, this isn't the spot where I want to play Jameis, in addition to the low implied team total, but we probably get 40 pass attempts from Jameis. And if we get 40 pass attempts, we have him attacking downfield. And so, yeah, I think this is a very interesting spot for Jameis triple. And in terms of where else can you cover 4 spots and have maybe a 50% chance at staying on a 200-point pace with those 4 spots? Nowhere else, right? So I think it's a very interesting spot. Then the question becomes, who are the triples, right? And so had it been Tillman playing, and Njoku out, my expectation was going to be that I would avoid Akins and I'd play the 3 wide receivers. Because when you watch it, Jameis is another guy that I've really paid close attention to his games instead of just looking at the box scores, but really watching these games. A lot of the Njoku stuff, it's like Jameis wants to attack downfield. Jameis wants to push the ball outside the numbers. And then Njoku is getting these catches in kind of comeback mode or these 2-minute drills or these throws, among bodies in the end zone. And that's where Njoku is getting his production. So it's like a lot of Njoku's not doing anything. He's not doing anything. And then all of a sudden, like down the stretch run, something big happens for him. With Tillman out and then assuming Njoku also misses, I think you could go either direction. I think you still want a triple, but you could go Michael Woods or you could go Jordan Akins. Jordan Akins, a very good receiving tight end. I think he'll step into that Njoku role to an extent. But again, that Njoku role has been like kind of more like 7 when all 3 wide receivers were healthy, it was like 7 targets per game, not the 10, 11, 12 that these wideouts are seeing. So you could go either way. On this one, I'll let you pick what we do here because I'm kind of indifferent. You can honestly play all 4 of these guys, right? Because of how cheap Michael Woods and Jordan Akins are as well.
Yeah, I went ahead and tossed in Akins. So here, obviously didn't say their names, but obviously now the double stack for the wide receivers is going to feature Jerry Jeudy and Elijah Moore. Jordan Akins out. It's honestly a little bit of a bummer, Jam, because I think this would have flown way more under the radar had Tillman been in actually. And now that condense in Njoku, like the projections on Jeudy and Moore are naturally going to come up. It's going to give people a longer look at Jameis. Although my guess is people will just play like a Jeudy or Moore one-off, and they won't be actually as willing to rip it in like this.
Yeah. And that was why last week, even though it was a bad spot, unfortunately, one of my 4 rosters in play that would have been one of my 5 had I not been so sick on Saturday was a Jameis double that I'd already kind of built, or a Jameis triple that I'd already built earlier in the week. And it was like, okay, I don't think he's going to hit against Pittsburgh, but the fact that I can play Jameis with 3 guys at low ownership and know that if one of these guys hits, probably all of them are hitting, right? And that's been the beauty of this is people are isolating these one-offs. People last week were wanting to play Jeudy, but when Judy's been hitting, Jameis has been going for 27 plus DraftKings points as well. And the other wide receivers, the other pass catchers have been going for solid price sensitive scores as well. And so, I would have preferred if everyone were healthy. Then it really flies under the radar. And yet, even with people being dropping out of this offense, we still have people who are going to say, oh, I want to play Jeudy as a one-off, as opposed to if Jeudy hits for 30 plus, Jameis is probably getting pretty close to that score as well.
Yep. One thing we didn't really talk much at all on the show about any of the Chiefs. I mean, we did mention Travis Kelce. I am kind of just curious, since I know you like this spot. Do you like the overall game? Are there pieces other than Kelce? The name that I actually meant to kind of ask you about was how you thought about Pacheco. 14 attempts last week. Over the past 4 weeks, the Cleveland run defense has given up some big games. I'm just curious, would you want to play this only through the Cleveland side, or are you interested in the full game environment?
So here's how I see this is that Kansas City has obviously played very much to their opponent all season. That doesn't guarantee that that's going to happen this week, right? Maybe Cleveland does poorly. Kansas City puts up a bunch of points, but probably if Jameis is throwing the ball a bunch and throwing picks and throwing incompletions and Kansas City is controlling this game, because here's the thing, Kansas City has not been explosive, but they've been really good in drive success rate. They're really good at picking up first downs. So the big concern here is if Jameis is struggling here, Kansas City could control this game. This game kind of gets shortened. The Browns don't have the ball enough for Jameis to have a big game, and it's just kind of low scoring across the board. On the flip side, if Jameis is hitting for big plays, do we really think that Kansas City's not keeping this game close? Do we really think that this is somehow a 30-17 win for the Browns? Probably not, right? So if we're thinking that Jameis can score 3 or more touchdowns, which is what we're really saying, with this stack, and throw for 300 plus yards, then we are expecting the Chiefs to score 3 or more touchdowns. then the question becomes, okay, is 3 or more touchdowns enough for us to really want to play one of these pieces? So because of the nature of what we're betting on with Jameis, we're not betting on this being this doesn't have to be a Bills-Rams game, right? It doesn't have to be both teams topping 30. It just has to be Brown scoring 3 touchdowns. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean one of the Chiefs' pieces is useful on the slate, but it does increase the chances of one of the Chiefs' pieces being useful on the slate. So I think that you boost Pacheco on a Jameis roster. I think you boost Kelsey on a Jameis roster. And I think that Xavier Worthy, while he's the least likely to hit, he's also the most directly correlated to Jameis having a big game, because Worthy's volume isn't going to increase. So if Worthy is hitting for a tournament winner, that means he's hitting 1 or 2 long plays. If he's hitting 1 or 2 long plays, that means Jameis getting the ball back that much more quickly, Jameis chasing points or responding to points. And so Worthy is he's like less likely to hit than Kelsey or Pacheco, but he's equal expected value, because if he does hit, like, that's pulling Jameis up that much more. So I mean, I think that you all across the board, right? It's like you can play Chiefs pieces. They're all kind of boosted in the setup, but also like 4 of my spots are covered here. I don't necessarily need to lock in a 5th with a Chiefs piece just to complete this story.
Let's, I mean, you can already see here we have 61.20 remaining per player. If we put a defense in, that's going to boost that even more. I mean, we're going to really be able to jam some high-end guys. I'm assuming this team has like Derrick Henry written all over it, but I don't want to lead the witness too much. Yeah,
this is interesting too, right? Because I've been building with the assumption that Tillman's playing. He's 2 weeks removed from the concussion, so reasonable to assume that. And so this kind of changes the salary structure even against what I've been working with. And so I was actually kind of assuming that Njoku would play too up until today, and so up until yesterday afternoon. And so yeah, let's go ahead and throw the Broncos defense in here just to get an even clearer sense of salary. Broncos playing against this tremendous Broncos defense, consistently scoring double-digit points, playing against Anthony Richardson, kind of the cheapest defense that I really like this week. And then, we see how much salary we have left over, $68.50 per position. So because there's not like a high-priced wide receiver that I'm going out of my way for, because there's not another high-priced running back I'm going out of my way for, very happy to throw Derrick Henry onto this and then see what we want to do with the rest of the build from there.
Yeah, because then you have, just listening to you talk, I know you have a narrow build at running back. I mean, this is actually a good thing to talk about right now, because we didn't get to it when we talked about Dowdle and Hubbard. Your thoughts about using those guys in the same roster, 2 running backs from the same game. Does that give you pause or not in this situation?
No, not in this situation, because Chuba he should have the backfield mostly to himself and get most of those touches. He's involved in the pass game. Rico Dowdle at this point I was looking at Ezekiel Elliott's carries throughout the season and just like lamenting the fact that he was getting 10 to 14 carries earlier in the year. Like, what? Does this team unserious at this point? Do they not care? Like giving Ezekiel Elliott 10 to 14 carries, but now it's all Dowdle. And so, if both guys are going to do a bunch of work on the ground, that slows the game down. That's also the offense is running through them. So I don't mind playing those 2 guys together.
All right. So we got 6,300. We got a running back, wide receiver, and flex. Where do you think we go here?
Yeah. So main things I want to be thinking about here are A, getting a running back that we like, and then B, maximizing our ceiling at wide receiver. So worried less about floor and more about ceiling. So running back, we could throw in, let's go ahead and throw in, I kind of prefer Hubbard over Dowdle. I was going to say throw in Dowdle to get the cheaper guy, but I prefer Hubbard. So we'll throw in Hubbard here. And then we still have 6,300 left per player. So basically a couple things we could do is, one, we could throw in one of these guys like a Jamar Chase or like a Tyreek Hill and then say, okay, where do we save the salary? Or we could take 2 of these kind of high 5K, low to mid 6K guys and try to maximize our ceiling. So something like that with the salary that we have left over would be like a Jalen Waddle plus a Courtland Sutton or plus a Garrett Wilson, where we could kind of try to target, floor and ceiling types of plays here on a roster that's going to be very different from what most people are doing.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I always kind of like living in that 6K range there, 6 to 7, and making sure you're getting all players who have that ceiling there. It looks at 5,700. That could give you Devontae, Higgins, Sutton, Garrett Wilson. Did it sound like Wilson was your favorite there?
No, I mean, I would say Sutton's my favorite. Next favorite might be Devontae Adams, because I do think that there's this. Let's throw Devontae Adams on this roster, honestly. I think there's just this fun component of, if you have a week where you don't have many B plays, and then you could be like, couldn't the Jets do something funky here? Couldn't they just throw the ball to Davante Adams 12, 13 times, try to get him a big game, try to get him multiple touchdowns? I think that's a fun angle to play. And you talk about, it's one of the reasons why I always like Addison, right? And I talked about him last week as like this guy who's going to hit for like 20 plus less often than other guys priced around him, but he's going to hit for 30 plus more often than other guys priced around him. I didn't see a 40 plus game coming, but we like plays like that, right? Well, Davante Adams is one of these guys who it's like, he's going to hit for 25 plus less often, but he still has 35 to 40 point games within his range of outcomes. And that's not the case for some other guys. So you get this guy who it's like, couldn't he surprise us with 35 to 40 points? You don't need to go off the board with something like that because, again, people are not going to be on this Jameis Winston triple stack. But this gives us a roster where, assuming that Akins is stepping into this tight end role and that Jameis is throwing the ball well, we're really not sacrificing anything anywhere. You know what I mean? Like we're getting a Brown stack that at Njoku's price, we would have felt comfortable, could have kept us on a 210, 220 point pace. And now we've got Akins' price in that group of players. And so we might be, falling into a 230, 235 point pace from our first four pieces here. And then you've got Derrick Henry, who's got 40 point upside. You've got Chuba Hubbard, who has 30 point upside. You've got Jalen Waddle, who has 30 point upside. Davante Adams, who has 35 point upside. Even the Broncos defense, right, that has 15 plus point upside. So just we're able to pack a lot of upside on this roster without really sacrificing a whole lot on it.
All right, there you go. As usual, guys, the caveats here, we are building as news is flying in. Literally 20 minutes ago, I was talking about backup Jets running backs. Now sounds like Breece Hall is going to play. When we started the show, we thought Cedric Tillman was going to be in, and now he's out. So this stuff changes quickly, but hopefully this gives you guys kind of the foundation to start thinking about this slate, gives you some ideas and allows you to start, hand building and building out some practice rosters that you can then finalize on Sunday. JM, good show as always. You mentioned a few of the programming up there on 1 week season this week. Again, a reminder, 70% off your 1 week sub. If you guys haven't signed up yet with promo code PETE70, PETE70 will get you 70% off. JM, you got another show on tap today. If people want to follow you around.
The Angles podcast solo pod. And then my show is Squirrel Patrol, where I always find a couple little nuggets that he's not thinking of, that I am, that I'm not thinking of, that he is, and kind of some final sharpening of our thoughts. I do want to, you mentioned earlier the thing about get your exposure to Kyler on underdog. And I think that sometimes people think like, well, I don't want to do, if I'm not betting on Kyler on DraftKings, I don't want to bet on him on underdog because I'm not betting on him having a good game. And I think little things like that is where we recognize like what the game is that we're playing. What the game is that we're playing is positioning ourselves to make money. And a lot of times that's saying something like, oh, Kyler's more sharp on underdog where people are not drafting him and less sharp on DK where everybody's rostering him at a high level. And so it's like, you're not betting on, you're not trying to predict if Kyler has a good game or not. You're trying to position yourself to make the most money on this slate. And so you see those things of like, oh yeah, on these rosters on underdog, I'm saying that Kyler has a big game. On these rosters on DraftKings, I'm saying he doesn't. And I'm kind of covered either way. And little things like that, I think sometimes fly over people's heads, or they kind of fight things like that because they think that these games are about predicting what's going to happen. And a lot of times they're not about predicting what's going to happen, but it's about understanding what makes you the most money. So yeah, I just wanted to call attention to that you brought up earlier and kind of highlight that as the little things that we can think about that are going to help us over time.
I've never, I think, told the story in conjunction with DFS, but it just like crystallized in such a great way. My cross country coach in high school, when I started running, I ended up getting a watch and I started, having a lot of fun. Like a lot of running is you're kind of competing against yourself. Like, can I get a better time? And he noticed me checking my watch too much during races, trying to get my split. And he told me, he's like, you are not in a race against the clock. You are in a race against the other people in this race. You need to go pick off the person in front of you. That's the same thing as DFS. Sometimes we're like, let me score the most points. Let me see what my threshold is. Like, that's not the game. The game is to outscore your opponents. And I think, like you said, playing on different sites, different salary structures, that really illustrates that this is a game against other opponents. It's not a game to score the most points.
100%. Love it.
All right. Appreciate you guys. Speaking of playing on other sites, we got the Off and On the Clock show with the Badge Bros. We had a fun live show last Friday in Dallas, back here in our own caves here for the Week 15 preview. So very similar structure to this show, but going through it from an underdog perspective. That is on this channel in the Badge Bros. The redirect should even keep you there if you guys just want to refresh. So we'll see you guys over there in 15 minutes. And then, yeah, join us for After Dark Saturday night with Mathology. That's for YouTube members. And then Sunday AM, the Cram as well, getting you ready for the slate. For JM, for the chat, appreciate all you guys. I'm Pete. We'll see you guys next time on the block.